as conceived by various European artists, illustrators of popular literature, school books, and exhibitions in the late 19th and 20th century. This was a time where women's roles and opportunities changed more quickly than any time else in history. Of course, these images tell us more about the lives of women in the period in which the art was created and less about prehistory itself, but they illustrate very well why I wanted to work on motherhood in prehistory, to challenge the biases and to get a fresh science-based view on motherhood in prehistory. So this famille Gaulois is probably one of the most famous illustrations of Iron Age nuclear family, unusual in the sense that it's actually here the father that engages with the child. Oh, sorry, I have to... Okay. Almost at the same time, Matthias Much's lecture on women in prehistory was illustrated with this image. This is also quite typical in the sense that children appear like accessories to the woman who are depicted in the style of a classical Roman pose. And then in the scene of the Nordic Bronze Age by Rasmus Christiansen on a school wall painting of 1907, men make the bronze tools, they till the land, and mothers and grandmothers stand in the entrance of the house. So the gender division leaves no uncertainty about the place women and their children are expected to be. The farewell of a group of warriors in the handbook of the Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum of 1921 shows adventurous men leaving mother, baby, and toddler behind. It emphasizes the active, mobile male lifestyle versus the woman as the homemaker. And now, of course, we know that it's actually the women in prehistory that were much more mobile than men. Images such as the Bronze Age trader depict women with children often anxiously grabbing the mother's skirt as if seeking protection. So having children is what defines the women in these images. And women in the past are often imagined to go through the same stages of life, from baby to girl, from mother to grandmother. And the transition to motherhood is thereby taken as a very normal, natural, and inevitable process. But in fact, the transition to motherhood is one of the most significant changes of identity a woman might experience. There were also women who never married, women that were infertile, women that remained child-free, women that had 1, 2 more successful pregnancies, women who died in childbirth, women whose children died, and women who became severely impaired and disabled from the bodily effects that pregnancies and childbirth have. So in this project, I wanted to look at the diversity of women's lives and take seriously that mothers might belong to a different identity category than women in general. So my ERC project ran from 2016 to 2021, and there we investigated social responses to pregnancy, birth, and early child rearing, and tried to relate the social to the reproductive status of prehistoric women. So we wanted to know if and how women's social status changed as they became mothers and how motherhood was conceptualized in the past. And through our case studies set in the last 3 millennia BC, we aim to develop an innovative bundle of methodologies to better understand motherhood. But in recent years, the interest in exploring motherhood in history and prehistory has definitely increased, with cultural, historical, and social archaeology approaches more or less at the same pace as bio-archaeological, isotopic, and genetic approaches. So motherhood includes a range of cultural choices and practices in addition to the biological framework of reproduction. Motherhood is about the potential relationship of any woman to her powers of reproduction and to children. And motherhood is also an institution, the social framework in which this takes place. So researching motherhood tackles both the biological aspects of pregnancy, parturition, and breastfeeding, and the ideological and social aspects of childcare, mothering. So I use the term mothering for a set of childcare practices that are usually associated with biological mothers, but not necessarily so. But it's still the fact that mothers traditionally and historically and still today predominantly perform childcare rather than other people who might help or substitute, also like siblings. I don't really like to use the term parenting because that hides and disappears the fact that actually most of the childcare work is still ideologically associated and also practically done by mothers. So one strand of our research was dedicated to working on the skeletal pelvis to identify and understand the factors that contribute to pelvic changes and bone reactions through pregnancy and childbirth. So our group has published a number of papers on describing and associating pelvic features to pregnancy and parturition. For example, a feature that's often associated with pregnancy is the preauricular groove. It's potentially caused by a ligament that attaches to the pelvic arch and under pressure of birth breaks off little parts of the bone, which are then remodeled and are apparent in these grooves. Men have preauricular grooves too, but they are shallower and they don't have the same remodeling structure as women. And we investigate this in detail with CT data. Philipp Mitteröcker and Lukas Waltenberger have worked on this a bit. And we found a clear relationship between body height and the expression of the preauricular groove. But we could also show that this is not the main factor. Births are not the main factor. In fact, age and the angle of the femur is much more involved in the formation of this feature. So, in fact, this is not the best way to look at whether a woman has given birth or not. And we looked at dorsal pubic pitting. That's relatively easy to spot if you actually have the bone part that you're looking at. Again, the dorsal surface of the pubic bone changes and remodels, probably as a result from pulling and stretching the ligaments connected to the pubic bones during childbirth. And in this feature, we do see a clear connection between birth and dorsal pubic pitting in the regression model. So we can perhaps use this feature to predict birth on the basis of the skeletal pelvis. But we can also identify mothers through the archaeological context. Graves of pregnant women with the fetus in the pelvic cavity are particularly interesting in that regard. So here I'm showing an individual from an early Bronze Age case study, Untitled that was found with the remains of a fetus, together with the remains of a fetus. The woman was first estimated at about 14 to 15 years, so a teenager. And we used the second aging method, dental cement humannulation, that came out with a slightly higher age. But otherwise, there is not a whole lot that's very different about this woman when we compare it to other women. At Franzhausen, for instance, there were 3 pregnant women discovered in the cemetery. They were of all ages, from early adult age to mature age, and all the graves have been reopened. There was again very little extraordinary about the women. They were buried in a similar way to others. An extra bowl placed next to the belly in one of the women might be intended for the fetus, and the presence of cutting tools might indicate or symbolize the cutting of the umbilical cord. It's quite interesting to think whether Bronze Age societies understood pregnant women as one individual or 2 individuals. This is a question that actually still plagues us today. If we think about the philosophical standpoints underpinning the abortion debate, does the individual start to exist at the conception, or with the fetus merely residing in the mother like in a container? Or is the fetus part of the gestating organism, like an organ that becomes a separate entity only at birth or even only after weaning? So the difficulty of dealing with the ontological status, the difficulty with understanding pregnant women, also led Bronze Age communities to experiment with different ways of burying people. So the women buried with a full-term fetus at Franzhausen II was cremated and buried with the baby when burning bodies was still a novelty around 1600 BC. And in the grave from Sotin, in contrast, the baby was given its own miniature urn that was then placed in the mother's urn. So this might hint that this child's social status might have already been understood as a distinct individual in the community. So one way to answer the question of how old women were when they first had their babies is to compile a list of all pregnant women who died in European prehistory, by which I mean really women buried with the fetus in the pelvic area or cremated together. And women have a higher risk of death at the first attempt of giving birth. And we saw in the data set quite a few pregnant teenagers in the Bronze Age, but in the Iron Age, women seem to have experienced the first pregnancies slightly later, not before 20. So this hints that motherhood might have, that social context of motherhood might have also changed, perhaps linked to a bit of a later age at marriage. And when we started our motherhood project about 10 years ago by now, so we applied forensic mitochondrial DNA analysis in comparison with Walter Parson from the University of Innsbruck to confirm or rule out mother-child relationships, because mitochondrial DNA is given from the mother to the child, so it's a sort of very simple test. But since then, advances in ancient DNA analysis have become so rapid that we later changed the strategy and are now working together with the Max Planck Center in Leipzig. You'll see more about this. But first, this was a very simple question. We have a woman buried, a 35 to 45-year-old woman buried with 2 children, a 3 to 4-year-old female that you might see here under the bowl facing the woman, and a 5-year-old male behind the woman's knees. And we just wanted to know, is this potentially the mother or not? You see the whole grave includes pottery household equipment, and the woman was adorned with jewelry of the time. And the little girl had a necklace, and the little boy was buried with a bone ring and an arm ring. And here we were quite surprised to learn that the children share the mitochondrial haplogroup to T2, but the woman belongs to a different haplogroup. So clearly the children couldn't have been her own biological children. But other relations can at this point not be excluded. For instance, the woman could be a paternal grandmother or an aunt. Mitochondrial DNA analysis was also able to shed light on the mother-child relations of the late Bronze Age sacrificial pit in Stilfrid, dated to around 900 BC. There were 7 individuals in this pit, an adult male, 2 adult females, and 4 children. And the 45-year-old was placed with a 6-year-old on her lap, kind of sheltering the child from the drama. And there was also an 8-year-old in immediate proximity. But only the child that was directly sitting on her lap was actually maternally probably related. The other child was not. And the field of ancient DNA analysis has developed so rapidly that we are now using a different strategy with full genome sequencing. And it's really super exciting because we're getting the first data now to see how individuals are related on the cemetery plan. So in which order they were buried. And this, we can also see how the cemetery was used chronologically, but also in terms of kinship. And so, in the current case study at the Drassenhofen in Lower Austria near the Czech border, there were 25 individuals found in 21 graves. And the individuals are usually buried in single graves, but there's also occasionally, here's a double burial in the northeast, and next to it is a quadruple burial with 4 individuals, including a newborn. And neonates are often just included in the last open grave, regardless of whether they were related or not. And this was also the case here. So we could identify the mother of the newborn. The mother of the newborn was buried quite at some distance away. Much closer was the aunt that died at around 16 to 17. And then we could also identify the grandfather, which must have died a little bit before the mother. So we can see both the sequence and also the kinship connections on the cemetery plan. And just to show you another relation, here we have a 30 to 39-year-old female that was the mother of a daughter and the mother of a son. Both died in adult age and most likely survived the mother. So, I mean, they could have just about died around the same time, even if the mother was only around 20 when she had her babies. They were probably still children when she died. So this also suggests that other members of the community must have been involved in taking care and raising the children. What's also interesting about this cemetery is that it's one of the few where we can identify adult women that stayed within the community and had their own children buried there. This is quite unusual in European prehistory because we're largely dealing with patriarchal societies where women moved away from their home community. But perhaps it's the sibling relationships that were of very crucial importance here. So I'm showing this image from two children that share a mitochondrial haplotype to stress that the archaeological context is really very important in this DNA analysis. You don't really have to do a test to understand that these people have emotional, social relationships with each other. And kinship is not the same as biological relatedness, even if there are often overlaps. And so we need to consider both this genetic data and the archaeological context information to really understand families. And the evidence for the treatment of children does not only include nurture and love, but also abuse and neglect. For instance, we have this 3 to 4 year old child from Unterhautsental with multiple health problems. And as a toddler, this child had a broken humerus that was then not corrected and healed in the wrong place. And most likely the child then died of meningitis. But nevertheless, the child was afforded a regular burial in the cemetery, placed and oriented with care. We also had a very interesting case from Schleimbach, a 5 to 6 year old child that was discovered in an early Bronze Age storage pit with no fewer than 4 blunt force traumata on the skull, inflicted by at least 2 different kinds of objects or weapons. And we use this as a test case for proteomic sex identification to understand if this child was a girl or a boy, thinking that the sex of the child might have had implications for how they were treated within the community. But also to understand whether this child was a victim of a conflict between villages or communities, or if this child was more likely to be killed or kidnapped. Interesting about this child are also the pathological conditions. The child was rather small for its age, but it also suffered most likely from middle ear infections, which might be very painful and might have caused speech delay, made the child cry a lot, driving the parents mad. So it's well possible that this child died actually at the hands of the mother who could no longer cope. But if we wanted to sum up some of the characteristics of early Bronze Age motherhood, we found a relatively young age at motherhood. We found no particular selection for motherhood. We didn't find social status correlated with potential features, skeletal features of birth. And we think that the social status reflects the reproductive potential. So it's for primarily girls of early reproductive age that were the richest in the cemeteries. But there is no difference in physical stress through pregnancy and birth between poor and rich individuals. So let us now have a look at the Iron Age. So I've previously worked on human representations of Central European Iron Age. They're incredibly diverse. They are executed in all different kinds of materials, techniques, from pottery to bronze, from lead to stone. So overall, it's also interesting to see that there's about 4 men represented for every woman. And there are only extremely few depictions of sexuality, pregnancy, and birth. So I would like to return to the question if all women in a given society became mothers. What I found very interesting in the Iron Age iconography is that they include sexless people, sexless bodies, along with representations of clear male and females. So the famous Kultwagen of Stradweg, we see a central female figurine, much larger than the others, and they're flanked by little figurines, clearly shown as male, as female. But there's also a pair of sexless persons holding the stag by the antlers, leading the stag to the sacrifice. And we have a very similar thing going on at the ceramic figurines of Gemeinlebern and Langenlebern that were probably arranged in a similar way to the wagon, just in a different kind of material, with clearly female-sexed figurines, male-sexed figurines, and a category of persons that seemingly don't have sex. So what does this mean? We can think about third genders, for instance, eunuchs, but more likely the distinction was along the lines of sexuality and reproduction. It seems quite clear that for one part of society, sexuality was emphasized, and for the other it was not. And by the early Iron Age, there's quite good reason to suspect that not all women have become mothers. Perhaps sexuality and reproduction was discouraged for a part of society, like for farmhands and maids in recent history, who needed property to start a family. So I'm thinking that perhaps as many as 25 to 30% of the women of the Iron Age remained unmarried, based on the argument that there are these sexless human representations, but also based on European historical census data, where it suggested that marriage rates are very tightly bound to the socio-economic microstructure. So crop and wine agriculture, marriage rates are high, but alpine areas where you need where you do dairy farming, marriage rates are very low because you need property to allow marriage. And then there's also differences in female dress. We might be able to distinguish unmarried and married women by their dress, because women wearing clothes in early Iron Age depictions are always shown with a veil that might indicate the marital status. In graves, pins and rings indicate the wearing of headdresses, although veils do not necessarily have metal components. And so there's this a good example from the grave 57 from the Magdalenenberg, where 16 bronze pins with bronze and amber heads were arranged in a symmetrical pattern, fixing a veil. And the buried individual was a woman aged around 20 to 40, and the co-buried child did not have a veil. So Mayoli Lenertz de Wilde has a long time ago suggested a differentiation between married and unmarried women from the Magdalenenberg on the basis of the headdress. So if pins and rings located at the ears really indicate marital status, this would also mean that a third to a quarter of all women on the Magdalenenberg remained unmarried. And marriage is also a motive of sigillar art. So within the upper strata of Iron Age societies, sexuality appears to have been very tightly controlled. So this is illustrated in the bottom on the sidula from Pieve del Pago in Italy, which has to be read from right to left. So it shows courtship, it shows sex in a variety of positions, and then it shows marital sex, which is indicated by the missionary position. And what's also interesting is that sex is never a private act. It always takes place under the eyes of a witness. And this is in a way logical, because the mother is always certain, but the father is not, unless you guard the woman and her sexual activities very, very closely. So in the absence of paternity tests, this was probably the only way to ensure the biological relatedness of the father. And that has really become a concern, at least by the Iron Age. The images from San Zeno and Montebelluna follow the same pattern. So you have the consumption of marriage taking place under social control. And if we look at the recently discovered second sigilla of Montebelluna, we see a woman in the upper frieze traveling. And this is, to the best of my knowledge, the only image of a woman shown on a two-wheeled vehicle. So it might hint at a patrilocal marriage pattern in which the woman changes the residence after or before marriage and is kind of brought to the ceremony this way. And then the second frieze shows a feasting scene along with, again, sporting competition, music, drinking, and the consumption of marriage. And what's also quite an interesting motif is the motif of two spinning women. This is something that we might see mirrored in the vessels from Sopron. And Serafini and Zaghetto have also argued that the differences in the shape of the women's belly might indicate that one is the pregnant mother to the heir, and the other one is the mother-in-law. So, and we have translated images in pottery here too. For instance, in Mayash in Austria, we have an adult and a child, or one could also read this as a pregnant woman. So there are definitely similar ideas that are crossing the Alps. There are very few images of childbirth throughout the Iron Age. Even in the classical Mediterranean world, there are examples. A few I've put here from Etruscan contexts or from Roman and Greek contexts. And this, of course, makes one wonder how often birth might have gone well, and how many women might have died while pregnant or within 42 days of termination of pregnancy, which is sort of the official WHO definition of death in childbirth. So the normal risk of dying today when nothing effective is done to avert death is estimated at about 1.5% per birth, of causes where you cannot really do much about, like placenta previa or things like that. And then if you estimate about 8 pregnancies per woman, you get to a lifetime risk per woman of 10 to 15% to die in relation to pregnancy and childbirth. The true mortality rate, of course, depends enormously on environmental and cultural factors, such as adequate nutrition, medical knowledge, beliefs about hygiene, social status of women, all different kinds of things. But it's also interesting that we don't actually find that many pregnant women in the archaeological record. And there are quite a few sort of reasons of why this might be. So one explanation might be that it could have been common practice to remove the fetus prior to the burial, which was common in ancient Rome and also even prescribed in Jewish law. And this might be also the origin of our practice of C-section. There's also remarkable finds of cut marks on fetal bones recovered in the 4th century BC settlement context in northern France that evidences extraordinary medical knowledge. The cut marks suggest that phytotomy was practiced. So this is a surgical delivery method in which the fetus is cut to pieces within the womb so that it can be delivered and can pass through the birth canal. This procedure was clearly only done when it was foreseeable that vaginal birth would not be possible, and the reduction in the size of the fetus was the only option to save the mother's life. Soranus of Ephesus described phytotomy for the first time around 100 AD. So it's really quite surprising to see archaeological evidence so much earlier. So phytotomy shows clearly that when things go wrong, the woman's life was privileged over that of the unborn child. But even if mothers have survived childbirth, they might suffer from the repercussions and side effects of giving birth. And one very common side effect of pregnancy is prolapse of the uterus. This is caused by strain through pregnancies and births. And this condition can be relieved by using pessaries, which essentially hold the womb up in place. And this gynecological treatment seems to go as far back as about 600 BC, as it's evidenced in some archaeological context where a ceramic ring is found in the pelvic area. And it's also interesting to think about this individual as some sort of difficult death or problematic death, because she was not buried in a regular cemetery, but she was buried in a settlement pit, perhaps because of her disabling condition. But there are now quite a lot of archaeologically documented cases like this, and the more people know about this, the more they are also found. So when the contexts become more widely known, recently was the publication of this early Latin grave that also has this kind of object exactly where it's expected for this function. So the few pregnant women that we do have in the archaeological record for the Iron Age come from quite different contexts. At Rottenburg-Lindele, for instance, there is a 25-year-old woman pregnant with a 6 to 7-year-old fetus that's been buried in a very central location in the grave, with very rich grave goods, and including a belt buckle that has contributed to the preservation of the fetus. But then we have also cases like this, where a burial in a settlement pit that's entirely different. So a mother who died giving birth, deposited in the settlement pits. The legs of the fetus are in the pelvic area. The head is under the woman's elbow. And so this unusual position of arms with the hands locked together as if in pain set the drama of her death really in scene. And at Dürnberg in Austria, only one pregnant woman has been discovered. But but young women and children were often buried with colorful beads of amber and glass, as well as various pendants and trinkets of bronze. And these are most likely served as amulets. So there's a group of newborns that does not normally make it to cemeteries. Newborns are often buried in settlement pits, particularly under door sills, perhaps at the threshold between life and death. In the Iron Age, people attempted to manipulate the threshold between life and death through medical knowledge and magic. So here I'm showing grave 322 from Dürnberg to demonstrate that medical knowledge doesn't seem to be restricted to men. The grave is a double burial of a male and a female, both of which are associated with surgical tools. Unusual is the number of bronze fibula for women, including some wonderful pieces in animal style, as well as a chain of bronze links that's usually worn around the neck rather than the waist. And her set of tools and amulets were deposited in a pouch at her feet. So perhaps she can be understood as the community midwife. So last, I would like to talk a little bit about infant feeding. It's an interesting development in the late Bronze and early Iron Age that we see an increase in the feeding vessel use that might be used like baby bottles today. And that's fascinating because Central Europe historically also had very low breastfeeding rates. And we wanted to know if the small vessels with spouts, sometimes found in children's graves, had any evidence of milk in them. So we searched for organic molecules in feeding vessels with mass spectrometry and isotope mass spectrometry in cooperation with Julie Dunny from the Organic Chemistry Unit at the University of Bristol. And this could tell us if the vessels were used for milk, for animal carcass fats, honey, or other substances. So this is just to give you an idea of what they might have looked like. They're incredibly diverse, usually 8 to 12 centimeters high, and stylistically often mirror the typical vessel forms of the time. But they're also really cute and playfully designed as children's material culture. This zoomorphic vessel is one of my favorites. The set of 4 was found in a cremation grave in Vösendorf near Vienna in the 1940s. And the opening is to drink. You can actually drink out of the animal's tail here. In the late Bronze Age, people normally cremated their dead, and some of the feeding vessels are also found in cremation graves like this. At Franzhausen-Cockeron, for example, the cremated remains of an infant were found with a feeding vessel in the urn. The child was half a year to 3 years at death, and we didn't recover any organic residue from the feeding vessels. It looks like it's never been used. But of course, you cannot really take the absence of evidence as evidence, so it might have just been included as a grave gift. Experimental work with some unfortunate children of archaeologists has also shown that feeding vessels do work. This is 1-year-old Noah drinking from some applesauce out of a replica. And here the diameter of the spout is quite large, but in reality it might be very, very narrow, only 1 or 2 millimeters, so that only a liquid such as water or milk could have been fed. So instead of taking a whole shirt of a vessel and crushing it, what's usually done with organic residue analysis, Julie Dunny developed a technique to sample with a dental drill to get just enough powder from the inside of the vessels to make the analysis possible. We only had one accident and drilled through the vessel, but the NHM's restorer kindly fixed it. It was actually not so easy to find feeding vessels securely contextualized with children in graves. We found 3 in Bavaria, grave 80 from Dietfurt Tennisplatz, a Hallstatt cemetery, where you see a young child buried with the feeding vessel. And then we had another one at Dietfurt Tankstelle, where again a young child was buried with a vessel and the feeding vessel inside that vessel. The isotopes of the organic molecules recovered from the ceramic matrix of these vessels clearly plot in the ruminant dairy range down here. And that leads us to quite confidently say that the vessels were indeed used for milk of cows, sheep, or goat. So we were actually able to find the proof for the very first baby bottles. So after confirming what feeding vessels were used for breast milk substitutes, it's perhaps also important to reflect what that means for mother-child relationships. The increased use of feeding vessels suitable for infants might indicate a change in childcare practices in the early Iron Age. Successful breastfeeding usually requires the mother and the child to be very physically connected most of the time. And the use of feeding vessels suggests that at times other members of the community could take over the task of feeding infants, and that might have made mothering a more collective, shared responsibility within the community. It may also have played a role in liberating women from a duty, perhaps sometimes an unwanted duty, much like when large-scale formula feeding was introduced in the middle of the 20th century. So perhaps bottle feeding has even contributed to the increase in women's mobility at the time where early centralization and urbanization trends are noticeable in the settlement record. Early weaning is associated with a quicker return of fertility for women, and therefore with closer sibling spacing and population increase. Again, this fits very nicely with late Bronze Age population increase and with the establishment of elites in the early Iron Age. Some of the feeding vessels that we tested from Fugging and Statzendorf in Austria had carcass fats from ruminants in them, perhaps from a soup or a stew. And the vessels are also of a larger type. So during the course of the Iron Age, vessels become larger and are more likely to be fitted with animal heads. They develop from small feeding vessels to ceremonial vessels that are then also found in men's and not in children's graves. So we can actually demonstrate that the contents of the vessels changes together with the vessel form. So that's perhaps one of the nicest bull-shaped vessels from Lower Austria on display in the Natural History Museum. It's the end of this development from zoomorphic feeding vessels to ceremonial vessels around 600 BC. And vessels like these are probably intended for libation, for the offering of food and drink at the gravesite. Okay, but if I return to sum up a few points about motherhood and mothering in the early Iron Age, from the region and time frame that I oversee, I would say that motherhood is by the Iron Age embedded in a social structure that's characterized by patrilocality and patriarchy. Marriage is an important concept for the elite, and the ideology of motherhood did not extend to all women. Iron Age women had their children relatively late in comparison to Bronze Age women. And there was a high level of gynecological and medical knowledge around that might have contributed to reproductive success. And there was a little bit of ambiguity in how to deal with the death in childbirth and death of newborns. Here we see a huge variation in the archaeological records. And last, alternatives to breastfeeding were available, suggesting that mothering duties could be shared within the community. And that's it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.